2 years ago, you'd be forgiven for not having heard Jordan Peterson's name. The clinical psychologist and University of Toronto professor made a name for himself on a much larger scale in 2016 after posting a series of YouTube videos, some of which became controversial, one of which he rejects the idea that the government might force him to use pronouns for transgender people, what he called a neologism of politically correct authoritarians. Anyway, long story short, the views of his videos that he had been posting on a whole pile of subjects went into the millions. He has a huge social media following and has become a leading cultural commentator or critic of our times. His track record, though, is considerable. His first book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, was published back in 1999, a work that examined how all cultures have created stories to grapple with and ultimately map the chaos into which we are all thrown at birth. He is, as well as a professor and an author, a practicing clinician. He has now synthesised his decades of experience into a new book, 12 Rules for Life, which has just been released. And Dr. Peterson joins us from Australia, I think. Welcome, good to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. Good to talk with you as well.
So of all the research you have done across so many fields, and your clinical practice and your personal experience, what was the process of synthesising that knowledge into what you believe to be 12 pretty essential principles or rules?
Well, the idea was to take concepts that often only exist at a level of philosophical or psychological or sometimes even religious level of abstraction and to make them concrete and practically applicable. And so the 12 rules that are outlined in the book are, I would say, commonplaces in some ways. They're things that people already know to be true, like tell the truth or at least don't lie. But in our politically polarized and topsy-turvy relativistic times, a lot of what once was self-evident needs to be properly rationalized and defended. And so that's what 12 Rules is an attempt to do, precisely that, is to go down into the substructure of belief and to find where the bedrock is with regards to what we might agree on moving forward peacefully together.
You've said there's a short history and a long history to the book, and I think the short history was you almost road tested it, didn't you? I think with some work that you were doing online, question and answer online, and did that help guide you as well as to where you were hitting nerves or where things were really answering questions that people had?
Sure. Well, I spent 15 years on a daily basis writing my first book, which is quite a difficult book. It's called Maps of Meaning. And then I taught courses on that book for 20 years and at Harvard and at the University of Toronto. And then I went online to this site called Quora and distilled that book in some sense into 40 rules in response to a post that someone had made about wanting to know what the most important things people should know in life. And the Quora answers, the list of 40, got a lot of response. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. It means that there's a upswell of interest in these sorts of concepts. And so that was part of what motivated me to produce this book for more popular consumption.
An antidote to chaos gets to the heart in some ways of the human condition. We crave order, but not too much.
Right.
We also are dealing, I was talking just earlier to Daniel Ellsberg about, the nuclear threat. We deal with an almost constant existential crisis that we somehow have to continue despite. So for you, this question of order and chaos, the yin and yang, as you say, or yin and yang as Chinese philosophy has held for so many years, does it get to the heart of human need, the need for both?
Well, it's not only the need for both, but the fundamental reality of both. I mean, we have, our brains are split into two hemispheres because the world is chaos and order. I mean, obviously that's something that needs to be unpacked, but it's true in the most fundamental sense. We all occupy a domain that we understand and can predict and control, right? And that's the domain that we want to stay in. That's our family, our community, our society, the space around the campfire. And then we're surrounded, all of that is surrounded by an almost infinite domain of chaos where the rules are different and where things are dangerous and exciting and challenging. And that's the eternal human landscape. That's the yin and yang, or chaos and order. And that's the environment of narrative and story and mythology. It's good and evil against a landscape of chaos and order.
And we are biological beings as well as psychological and emotional beings. If we reference back in a moment, just for a moment, to maps of meaning, the architecture of belief, it does seem hardwired in the human being, be it religion or mythology, the idea of story as a way of explaining the unknown. And how does that still present itself in our lives?
Well, the thing about human beings is we're not exactly information processing machines. Like, we're not conceptual machines. We're actors in the environment, which is why we like drama so much, why we like movies and stories, why we'll line up to see them, because stories present a pattern of perception and being, and our fundamental problem isn't what is the world. That's a problem, but our fundamental problem is how do we act in the world? And story is the map to action in the world, which is why we're so absolutely fascinated, intolerably fascinated by stories. Our cognitive architecture has a narrative substructure, and Maps of Meaning was an attempt to lay out that cognitive substructure, and then 12 Rules for Life, an attempt to make that idea, again, more publicly and practically accessible, without oversimplifying it, because it's not, 12 Rules for Life is not a simple book.
Before we get into that, what are the fundamentals of that cognitive substructure that we are living with, whether we know it or not, and that we are managing, I guess, as hopefully the operator of our own lives? What are the fundamentals?
Well, you might think of yourself as a creature that's always in need of a map, because the territory is too complicated to understand, so you need to map it, and that's your conceptual world. But the purpose of the conceptual world is to help you navigate and orient. And so what you really need to know is where you are, right? You have to know what point A is, and then you have to conceptualize what your goal would be, your point B, and then you have to plot a course. And when people tell one another stories, that's what they're doing. They're saying, look, I was here, and this was the conditions of being here, and I decided to go there, and that was my adventure, and here's a bunch of things, expected and unexpected, that happened along the way, and the transformations I had to undergo in order to continue my voyage. And that's really the basis of almost all communication, that the filling in of that pattern. You know, even when you ask someone how their day went, you're asking for a little microcosmic representation of that broader pattern. And the pattern itself is, well, one of the fundamental patterns is the heroic pattern, which is the conflict with the voluntary conflict with the terrors of chaos and the gaining of something valuable, and then the sharing of that as a consequence. It's the oldest human story, and it's expressed it's expressed everywhere, but it's most profoundly expressed in religious stories.
There is another matter, and Norman Doidge, the wonderful Norman Doidge of The Brain That Changes Itself fame, Plasticity of the Brain Expert, there's another part, and he alludes to this in his preface to the book, which is, yes, we are trying to navigate these uncertainties and plot our path, but we are so conscious of others. And you said the way we act. You talked about the way we act. How much of this also is about the human need for validation? What he described as in our deepest parts of our psyche, we all want to be judged. We also fear being judged. Where does the need for validation by others fit in all this?
You might say, we have three serious problems in life, let's say. We have to put up with ourselves and our fragility and our proclivity for malevolence. So we have to put up with ourselves as individuals. And then we have to put up with other people, for better or for worse, and both, obviously, because other people are unbelievably useful, but they're also very troublesome, both in the family and the broader social collective, as tyrants, as partners, as competitors. We have to negotiate that, and then we have to set ourselves up against the natural world with its beauties and opportunities, but also its horrors and catastrophes. And that's the fundamental existential landscape. And so we have to negotiate. We have to constantly negotiate our peace with other people. And that also helps establish our psychological stability, because there is no psychological stability without reciprocal cooperative endeavor. So
it is a fascinating series of chapter headlines that clearly each represent a broader set of behaviours. Let's start with making friends. Let's, if you don't mind, you come in with one that you think is the most pertinent, or your favourite, or most revealing perhaps for the listener. But make friends with people who want the best for you. And second, rule 4, compare yourself with who you were yesterday, not to whom someone else is today.
Sure. Well, the first one is a form of. There are both moral injunctions. The first one is an understanding that it's in a continuation of Rule 2, which is treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. So let's make the assumption that you have a moral obligation to treat yourself decently, even though you're aware of all your faults and inadequacies. You should care for yourself like you matter. So, and then, because what you think about this is that if you need to construe yourself as someone that matters. Our societies can't remain stable and our interactions can't remain peaceful unless we each admit to one another that our existence matters. It's important. If you treat people like they're not important or that they don't matter, then you're going to run into very difficult times in your social relationships instantly. People don't like being treated that way. So we could start with the assumption that people matter, and that includes you. And so you should take care of yourself. You have a moral obligation to take care of yourself, even if you don't like yourself. It's not the point. And then part of that is to surround yourself with people who want the best for the best in you. And that's another moral obligation. It's like you should have friends who are happy when you tell them that good things happen to you, and who are unhappy when you tell them that bad things happen to you. You should have friends that support you in your attempt to strive upward and to stay away from the abyss. And it's okay to pick people like that. In fact, it's morally obligatory to surround yourself with people like that. And so Chapter 3 is a rationale for that and a guide to doing that. And sometimes that means you have to make hard decisions because you have someone in your life and maybe you even love them, but they're not aiming up and they're not facilitating your movement towards the light, let's say. And it's necessary under those conditions to make a difficult choice because you're not doing yourself or them any good by putting up with their downward trajectory. So that's what Rule 3 outlines. And then Rule 4 is an attempt to help people deal with the necessity of a hierarchy of values without falling into a pit of resentment. So we need hierarchies because they give us something to aim at. There has to be an up to have something to aim at. And if there's an up, there's a down. And if there's an up and down, then there's a hierarchy because up is better than down. And so, but the problem with hierarchies is that they produce inequality and they also produce judgment because if you're participating in a hierarchical game and you're not attaining up, then you're failing. That's the judgment. It's the price you pay for having values. Well, you say, okay, well, you want to have values because you need something important to aim at. Well, and that means that you can fail and you can compare yourself badly with other people and you can become bitter and resentful, which seems to be a bad end. So it might be better if you aimed up and when you're judging yourself, let's say, within the confines of that game, the person that you're comparing yourself to isn't another person, but to who you were yesterday or even to who you are today. Because it's almost inevitably the case that if you're striving towards something worthwhile, you could be slightly better at it today than you were yesterday, especially if you aim low enough. And so Chapter 4 is a description of that. It's like use yourself as your baseline. You're the thing against which you want to judge your improvement. And that takes you out of the game of resentment and the game of comparison. At least it detaches you from it to some degree.
I'm going to link 2 chapters here for you to speak to that do seem to go to the heart of our broader communication challenges at the moment. The first is Rule 6, set your house in perfect order until you criticise the world. Have I read that correctly?
No,
before you, exactly, someone's written it wrong, before you criticise the world. And the later rule, Rule 9, assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. Again, what's the human condition that you are speaking to there?
Let's start with the second one. Assume that the person you're listening to might know something you don't. Well, that chapter is a guideline to, let's say, domestic argumentation. It's also a guideline to some degree to political argumentation, but I think it's more appropriate in the domestic sphere, because when you're dealing with people who you're intimately associated with, conflict always arises. And it arises partly because you're both ignorant, right? There's much more about the world than you need to know. So sometimes you're just simply wrong. And then the two of you who are disputing are different, and so you have to bridge the gap between those differences, and that's very difficult. And then you're also facing the difficult problems of life, and often to conceptualize those properly and to formulate a joint map, there has to be conflict in formulation. So you have to be able to withstand that without it breaking your relationship. And so the idea behind Chapter 9, and I derived a fair number of these ideas from Carl Rogers, who's a great clinician, one of the great mid-century, 20th century clinicians, is that you have to understand when you're engaged in a dispute with someone that you don't know nearly enough to make your life everything it could be. And there's some ghost of a possibility that if you listen carefully to the person that you're having a conflict with, despite their ignorance and biases, which are just as extreme as yours, that they might, in some manner, let something slip that would be of use to you when you're plotting your course. And that might mean that you can avoid a disaster. It's like, so each conversation should be approached as an opportunity, if possible, assuming goodwill on both sides, for both of you to come out of the conversation slightly less blind than you were when you went in. And since blind people fall into pits when they walk forward, it's a good idea to rectify your blindness to the degree that's possible. Rogers had a good method for helping people in their conflictual disputes. He said that it's useful when you listen to your opponent, let's say, or your competitor or the person you're cooperating with, it's useful to listen to them and then to summarize what they told you and say it back to them until they agree with your summary. It's a very useful technique because it means you can't turn them into straw men. It means sometimes you might even have to formulate their arguments better than they formulated them themselves, especially if your partner isn't very articulate. So that means at least you understand what it is that the other person is trying to put forward. And his observation was that would often take a fair bit of the acrimony out of the conversation because at least it demonstrates the willingness to listen on your behalf. And if you're striving towards peace in your discussions, which is what you're doing if you have any sense, especially if you're arguing with someone you have to live with, then formulating their argument properly and really addressing their concerns means that you might be able to actually solve the problem and not have to argue about it for the rest of your time together. So that's rule 9. And
go ahead.
Rule 6 is a meditation on horrific crimes, really. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the motivation of people like the high school shooters, and particularly the person who went into Sandy Hook in the United States and shot up. It was an elementary school who shot elementary school kids. Very, very dark behavior. You have to dwell in something very much akin to hell for a very long time before you dream up something like that. And so, Rule 6 it's a rationale for such crimes. I'm trying to put the reader in the head of people who do that and to show why they do that and to make a case for it so that we can understand it. It's a horrible case. And then to make the counter-argument. And part of the counter-argument is, well, people become embittered by life because life treats them very harshly. Life is a very hard game for everyone, but some people have it particularly rough and are brutalized by life and become vengeful and seek destruction as a consequence. And the Chapter 6 is a suggestion, which is, well, look, your life is treating you brutally, let's say, and resentment and vengeance is growing in your heart. It's like, what can you do about that? And the best answer to that is something like, well, you might start by asking yourself if you're doing absolutely everything you can to put everything in order around you before you dare judge the structure of reality itself and decide to take revenge on it. There's many things in people's lives that they could put right if they were willing to do the work. And it's very salutary to sit down and think, okay, well, I'm not very happy and I'm suffering stupidly and it's making me angry, but perhaps there are things I could do that would make it slightly better. Think, well, put those things in place diligently, for 5 years or for a decade, and see what happens if you stop making the mistakes that you know you're making. And that's a better alternative than daring to judge the world and then wreak havoc within it. So that's Chapter 6 is a very dark chapter. But we need to understand these things because they keep happening.
I know you contemplated a lot in earlier work a lot of your work on ideology was this writ large. It was the darkness in the human heart writ large, and then the way we seem to reinforce it in each other. And again, I came back to the fact that we are creatures of biology, including our genetics and our hardwiring, as well as creatures of emotion and creatures of psychology. Let's touch on children, because this is where we can hopefully set people on a healthy path rather than a healthy path. Perhaps the two rules here are fairly self-explanatory. Rule 5, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And Rule 11, do not bother children when they are skateboarding.
Right. Well, it's good of you to group those two together, because that makes a lot of sense. The first one, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. It's a double-edged sword, that rule. The first is that your children can do things that will make other people, including you, dislike them. Make no mistake about that. And that's not good, because if you're a caring and encouraging parent, what you want to do is help your children maintain that delightful childhood innocence and beauty that makes people around them open up their hearts. You want your children to be welcomed by adults genuinely, and you want them to know how to play with other children well enough so other children are happy to have them around. That's your job as a parent. And to do that job, you have to regulate their behavior so that they are socially acceptable. And you can do that by consulting your own resentment and dislike. You know, adults, even though they don't like to admit this to themselves, are not happy when they're dominated by 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds or 7-year-olds or 13-year-olds for that matter. It makes them very angry when the people that they care for don't reciprocate properly and misbehave and mouth off and act improperly and rudely and disrupt the social situation and don't manifest their responsibilities properly, etc. And parents will take revenge against their children when they misbehave. And so what Chapter 5 does is detail out a philosophy of discipline. And it's predicated on the idea that in a household, like in a society, there should be a minimum number of rules. You don't want more rules than are necessary, because the enforcement cost is too high, it's too complex. And then those rules need to be enforced with minimum necessary force. And I try to walk through that and to justify it by pointing out that, well, being a parent is a hard job. It's very demanding, and you need to take some time for yourself so that you can do the things that you want to do and that you need to do to live as a successful adult, and so that you can spend some time with your partner so that your relationship maintains its health and its longevity. And in order to do that, you have to put boundaries around your children's behavior. And if you do that properly, then you get to do what you need and want. You get to have a functioning relationship. You get to like your children. They get to be encouraged, and everyone wants them around and wants to play with them. And that's a really good deal. But it means that you have to admit that there is such a thing as misbehavior, that it's your responsibility to quell it, and that you could be quite the monster if you don't set things properly in order. So that's Rule 5.
I'm tossing up on two final questions to you. Do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to park. I wanted to get into, and we're not going to have time, and I want to come and talk to you another time, the experience you've gone through the last couple of years, but I wanted to put it in the broader context, which is how do we navigate the different and changing rules and morals that come to predominate in a given time? Do we accommodate them, say civil rights in the 1960s because they change our thinking, or do we push back against them? I'm going to ask to talk to you about that another time in light of your experience, because you have written a lot on the question of anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and depression. And having just spoken about parenting in the modern era right now, we seem to be having in this country, and I'm sure in yours, something of a near epidemic of anxiety in a young generation coming through. So for my last question, is that over-diagnosis or more precise diagnosis, or do we have a new and particular problem right now?
No, I think it's a consequence. It's a demographic consequence in some way of people having fewer children, like one, and later in life, and consequently overprotecting them. The way to generate anxiety in people is to treat them as if they're fragile. And this is well known among clinicians. This isn't a disputable topic. If you want to treat someone who has an anxiety disorder, what you do is you don't really make them less anxious. You teach them how to be braver. And so you don't reduce the anxiety of children by making the spaces around them ever safer. All that does is highlight the dangers of the spaces outside of the safe space. What you do instead is teach them that they're the sort of people that can prevail in a world of uncertainty, that there's much more to them than meets the eye. And that's what you do when you encourage children. And that is Rule 11, which is don't bother children when they're skateboarding. When they're out there taking the necessary risks of life, which are real risks, you have to back off. You have to allow them to take necessary risks so that they become competent and courageous. And that's the antidote to anxiety. And we have this epidemic of over-involved parenting. It's the rise of the Freudian devouring mother, right? The person who does so much for you that you can't do anything for yourself. That's like the witch in the Hansel and Gretel gingerbread house. It's all candy and shelter on the outside and all devouring witch on the inside. And that's definitely an epidemic. So, and it's facilitated by such things as safe spaces at the universities and coloring book rooms and teddy bears, and all of which are appropriate for a frightened 3-year-old, but absolutely unacceptable for even someone who's 12 or 13, let alone someone who's in university, and also not helpful. Quite the contrary.
Let's talk later in the year. If you could make that time again, I know you're contemplating another book actually on the other question I flagged. So I'd love to be able to approach you again later in the year about that other question. It seems to be another crisis of our times. So thanks for your time. Jordan B. Peterson, the book is 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos. Antidote to chaos. Antidote to chaos. Antidote to